Greetings. My name is Cara Page, and I am coming to you by way of Muncie Lenape land here in Brooklyn, New York, in the United States. It is my honor to join you. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I am a light-skinned Black woman with hexagonal tortoiseshell glasses, red lipstick, and gold hoops. My hair is pulled back, a peppered gray and black hair, and I'm wearing a bright green top. And behind me, a beautiful orange, purples, black and white flowers from a central Mexican quilt. There are a few bowls and vessels behind me and a off-white wall. It is my honor and privilege to bring to you a little bit about healing justice as a political framework in the United States and as really the continuum across many continents of the understanding of the role of collective care and safety in our liberation movements. I do have a slideshow that I would love to share with you that I will share now. Hold on for a moment. So just to give you a little bit of history about who and how Healing Justice Lineages came to be, I'm going to speak a little bit about the ways that inside of a U.S. Context, how healing justice, collective care, and safety strategies emerged inside of liberation movements, and talk a little bit about the early 2000s in particular, when we were responding to immense fascism, anti-Black racism, transphobia, so many things at that time that it called for a political cultural response from healers and health practitioners that were at the front lines holding a lot of collective grief and generational trauma and burnout in our communities and in our movements. And that's really how healing justice emerges. And I am one of the co-founders and co-architects of Healing Justice by way of being a member of the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective, which I'll talk more about our roots and how we came to be. I'm also an artistic director, co-founding member of Changing Frequencies, which is a political cultural memory project where we create cultural memory installations that memorialize and give homage to those who have survived or been disappeared inside of the medical industry. Healing Justice Lineages is also a book that I have co-edited with Erica Woodland. It speaks to the arc of healing justice as a political framework and to the lineage of collective care and safety strategies as integral to political liberation movements in the United States and in particular in the Global South. It was an honor to co-write this book with Erica, and it also features other writers and many, many voices of practitioners across the United States, including Puerto Rico. And we do hope to create a global conversation because we know it is deeply a part of all of our lineages to have healers and health practitioners rooted in abolition and liberation be deeply involved in our movements. And we hope this book pays homage to but some of the stories of how many of us have been at the front lines holding generational trauma, responding to harms and abuses, and looking to build collective care strategies that do not rely on state control and violence. I want to name here, this presentation will be mainly within a US context. That is where we evolved out of the United States Southern experience. And just to be crystal clear, we know there are many movements, as I said previously, on many continents that we could map the role of healers and health practitioners who are deeply political, who have created immense change for their communities and movements. So it is my belief that every movement for our liberation has included strategies of care and protection, that we always look at in the United States context, the abolition of slavery and the Underground Railroad as a liberation movement to free Black people from slavery was led by ancestors such as Harriet Tubman, who did immense work not only as a freedom fighter and also as a healer, as a root worker and a birth worker, and how we hold all of that truth, that was just as important, that she was birthing the next generation as much as she was freeing the next generation on the Underground Railroad. The Black Panther Party is another prime example. The ways the Black Panther Party understood that we must defend and protect our communities in the face of anti-Black racism, white supremacy, capitalism. How can we make sure our people are taken care of? And programs that they created, like the breakfast program, self-defense and survival programs, that were deeply embedded in training up Black communities and understanding the role of healing as integral to political liberation. We also give thanks to the Young Lords, a Latinx, predominantly Puerto Rican liberation movement that rooted itself in understanding, again, how to protect and defend its communities. The HIV/AIDS movement, the response to HIV/AIDS and the being led by queer trans liberation movements and harm reduction movements all over the world. And I'll talk a little bit more about liberatory harm reduction as a tool for healing justice. But to understand that the role of liberation that resisted the ways HIV/AIDS, the epidemic itself, tried to pathologize queer and trans people, Black and brown people, poor people, incarcerated people, and tried to invisibilize our experience, and how we turned a resistance movement to center ways care needed to be given with dignity and grace, and was political in all the ways care needed to be provided for our communities. And Black Indigenous birth workers in the United States South, Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective, who I'll explain more about, we centered the narrative and the lineage of Black and Indigenous birth workers because we understand them to be at the front lines, that they literally helped to birth the next generation of Black folk during slavery and in the face of colonization. And in the same boarding school healing project, the ways that, as an extension of colonization and state violence, dismissed memory, literally tried to erase memory for Indigenous tribal nations by putting children, generations of children, in the boarding school system to harm, abuse, and literally help children try to forget their lineage, forget their Indigenous traditions, tribal cultures. And so the Boarding School Healing Project, which is also based in the US, but international in its frame and reach, and understanding how to interrupt the erasure and how to reclaim the stories of the survival of the boarding schools, and to understand the horror of the boarding schools and how they are a part of colonization and state control. Specific to the US Southeast, Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective came to be because we were responding to a particular moment of generational trauma, burnout, and long-term stress from violence and systemic oppression. And because we were studying as Black and brown and white abolitionists, healers, nurses, doctors, social workers, birth workers on the ground, we understood Global South was also, in the Global South, there were many models of how doctors and nurses were fighting for their traditions to exist, their herbal traditions outside of allopathic medicine. And we wanted to understand, what is our relationship to the Global South abolitionist, Global South feminist traditions in relationship to the US Black feminist traditions and abolitionist movements. Again, you'll hear parts of New York City behind me, so it's like being here. Based on an understanding of medicine, healing, and care, not as profit, but healing justice seeks to understand medicine, healing, and care as integral to political liberation, as community-led and survivor-led, And for us, it became a way for healers and health practitioners to come together to organize intentionally around the cultural, political, spiritual, environmental, psychic, and physical well-being, but really care and safety of our people. During incidences of heightened violence by the state, during incidences of natural disasters like Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, things that we knew deeply impacted our communities, and we want to build infrastructure so that we can be on the ground in response, in relationship to our people's needs, so that they feel cared for and safe outside a state system of care, of medicine that we feel is deeply rooted in transphobia, ableism, racism, misogyny, and capitalism. There are so many health inequities, and based on our community's identities, the COVID pandemic has shown that immensely for all of our countries. And so for us in the early 2000s, we were barely at the tip of understanding what does it mean to respond on a regional level in the Southeast in the US, let alone imagining a global level of how we can organize the role of healers and health practitioners who are rooted in abolition and rooted in care and safety strategies. I've spoken a lot about Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective. Again, I'm a founding member. We are a Black feminist-led, multiracial, multigendered, intergenerational, queer, trans, and allies network of Southern-based abolitionist social justice healers, health practitioners, birth workers, therapists, and social workers who organize care strategies. Integrative, we mean in terms of that we value different kinds of medicine, root work, and care strategies. We don't identify one as better than the other, and we don't make a distinction between allopathic medicine and other traditional ideas and methods of care. We are rooted in movement building to transform generational trauma. In the early 2000s, we wanted to create a political strategy that we feel valued the role of healers and health practitioners in the Southeast in particular. And so we identified a frame that we called healing justice because we wanted to understand what is the role of healing in relationship to social justice movements. We know healing is a strong term. We know that it risks ableism, but we meant healing in the terms of not to cure anyone, not a curative model of healing, but a healing that allows for the autonomy of community and individuals to be able to respond to and intervene on generational trauma from systemic oppression, violence, and policing. And we believe that we must recover and remember our ancestral medicine and build new traditions that center our psychic, emotional, physical, mental, spiritual, and environmental well-being for our collective liberation. In the early 2000s and 2007, this was the political strategy that we moved forward and shared with the United States, other healers, health practitioners, social workers, cultural workers, birth workers, who were also abolitionists, who were also at the front lines and wanted to see how we could build collective care strategies for our communities. The missing part of this is as the political framework has changed, we now include building power, that we are not just healing for healing's sake, but that we are building a political response and cultural response to generational trauma to build power collectively as healers and health practitioners. Healing justice has 5 core values. One, that collective trauma can be transformed, that we actually believe, we have the audacity to believe that we can interrupt and disrupt the pain from generational trauma, from colonization, slavery, and violence in our lives. Another value is there is no single model or right model of care. that we don't presume one is more important than the other, but how do we imagine multiple models and practices of care for ways we can hold our people's emotional, spiritual, psychic, physical sustainability? Community must have the autonomy and agency on how we choose to heal in our communities is a third value, and very important, especially for people who are incarcerated, detained, and isolated from community, who should always have the autonomy and agency to choose how they are treated inside of carceral systems. Healing strategies are rooted in place, and we root in the South, we root in Black and Indigenous Southern ancestral traditions based on who we are as a collective. We also root in migrant traditions from different migrant communities in the Southeast who are represented in our collective. Healing justice holds an anti-capitalist, Black feminist, abolitionist lens, and centers disability, reproductive justice, transformative, and environmental justice analysis. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I mean. There's one piece that I wanted to share with you, and that is it's been important for us to acknowledge that in the work of collective care and safety strategies and interrupting generational trauma, we have always looked at 4 places that we find need to be considered how we imagine care and healing strategies. These are the four quadrants, if you will, and these were co-created with Southerners on New Ground for their organizing school. And Southerners on New Ground is a queer, trans, gender nonconforming, intersex liberation movement in the Southeastern United States, led predominantly by Black, Indigenous, and queer people of color. We looked at ways we needed to understand our relationship to land, our relationship to work and economy, our relationship to bodies, and our relationship to spirit and culture. Because if we weren't wrestling with ways generational trauma, ways state violence and control have imminently contained and forced our experience of land, of economies, of bodies, of spirits, then it's harder for us to even imagine what can we imagine and create outside of these state models or ways that these 4 quadrants have been controlled in our communities. So we had to wrestle with, as healers, as health practitioners, as root workers, as birth workers, how are we building care strategies, abolitionist strategies that heal the harm of land, that understand work and economies that don't value survivor-led economies and anti-capitalist ways of being, to understand our relationship to collective bodies of care. How do we build an interdependence on how we take care of each other instead of individualizing care as isolated incidences and not an arc of collective care strategies? And how do we imagine spirituality, understanding spirit in the widest sense, and how we imagine culture, memory that allows us to have, inherit, and recall the displacement of our traditions and the dismemory of our healing strategies. It is part of the capitalist program, part of the colonialist program, for us to forget what has allowed us to survive. And so spirit and culture, we feel, are very central to a political liberation strategy around collective care. I've spoken several times about generational trauma, so I just want to land a working definition. Some people say historical, others say generational trauma, and I want to give deep respect to Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who built the historical trauma framework in response to the colonization and attempted genocide of Indigenous tribal nations. So when I say, and when Kindred says generational trauma, we are saying, how do we pass on the memory of a physical, emotional wound of a traumatic incident. For each generation on a cellular level, we do remember and recall the grief of unhealed, and I apologize for the typos, we do recall and pass on through our cellular memory generational grief from immense violence, from colonization, from the wounds of our ancestors. And how do we understand that to be an imprint, a blueprint of our collective bodies? And how does that change our work and change who we are in our work to even understand that we are building memory and that we are constantly moving through the suffering of our ancestors from war, genocide, slavery? One of the long-term impacts of generational trauma is also collective. I'm sorry, it says disassociation, but I've been challenged that that is a very mainstream constricting word that's been used to pathologize queer and trans folk, especially, and people who have mental and developmental disabilities. So let me change in real time. What I understand is a collective disconnection, that generational trauma can be a collective disconnection or a loss of memory of an incident of harm or abuse. What if suddenly we didn't remember the experience of war? What if we weren't able to remember the experience and the trauma of slavery? That would displace us from a story, a narrative, a lived experience. And finally, generational trauma can mean that those most impacted by trauma don't remember what it is like to not live under constant stress and surveillance at all times. Well, I'm going to apologies, we had technical difficulties, so just jumping right back in to the slide deck. I want to tell you a few more things about the strategy. What's important to know is healing justice has been shaped by many movements and political frameworks. When we first started talking about healing justice as a frame, it was around 2005, 2006. And all of us as healers and health practitioners, we were also doing organizing work on the ground in these different movements to understand the implications of the medical industrial complex, which really we saw as a system of care that was rooted in violence, rooted in slavery, rooted in ableist supremacy and gender supremacy. So understanding how medicine has been really deeply embedded in old, archaic ideas of bodies, of disease, of who is diseased and who is fit and unfit. And so as practitioners coming through schools of healing or health and learning these old ideas that were rooted in eugenics and ways of believing that some of us needed to be disappeared or literally genetically removed because of our disability or predilection to criminality because of our race and gender or class. So we really understood as healers and health practitioners, we needed to be accountable and hold medical systems and care systems accountable while both imagining radical collective care strategies outside of state. These movements and frameworks help to shape that. The first one being disability justice in 2005, a movement that emerged out of leaders such as Patty Byrne, Mia Mingus, Stacey Milburn, Leroy Moore, Eli Clare, and Sebastian Margaret, who had begun discussing a second wave of disability rights and ultimately moving into a political framework, which is now a global movement called disability justice. And here is a quote from Patty Byrne to explain a little bit of disability justice. It is a framework that understands all bodies are unique and essential, that all bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We know that we are powerful not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. Like transformative justice, reproductive justice, and environmental justice, it implies a movement-building strategy and an anti-capitalist critique. And again, that's Patty Byrne, one of the co-founders of the Disability Justice Movement, and also a founding director of Sins Invalid, a disability justice performance troupe in the United States, which has gone to create amazing and immense art that challenges and breaks and disrupts the mythology of disabled narrative and lived experience. So just a quick visual that comes out of their book, the Sins Invalid book, Disability Justice Primer, where they visually show some of the principles of disability justice, that it must be rooted in intersectionality, that leadership of those most impacted by ableist supremacy must be centered, that it is anti-capitalist, and across all movements that disability justice must be integrated, that it builds wholeness and sustainability across a disability solidarity lens, and is deeply rooted in a collective, interdependent way of being. That how do we understand that ableism isolates individuals to not believe that we cannot build interdependence around how we take care of each other's needs, physically, emotionally, developmentally, and so on. Instead of creating this sort of hierarchy of one is better, one body is better, or able-bodied is better, or creating a hierarchy that, an isolation that you must be independent or you are dependent, right? So where do we build a cross-collaborative, collective access model? And it is always rooted in liberation. Another movement is the environmental justice movement. Environmental justice as a grassroots movement that has sought to reconnect our relationship to the earth and center respect and integrity for our cultures, for our languages, and our beliefs about the natural world and our roles in healing ourselves. This is named in the environmental justice principles developed in 1991 at the National People Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991. Hold on. The reproductive justice movement and framework were founded by the Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Health Collective in the late 1998. The reproductive justice is having the economic, political, and cultural power and resources to make decisions over our own bodies, families, and communities for us all to thrive. Hold on one moment. Technical difficulties. Sorry, y'all. I'm going to pause for a second so that I can change the sound. Sorry. All right, comedy of errors. There's a lot of excitement today. Apologies for the interruption. So I'm going to finish the slide, Jack, just to land any final questions about the framework and other movements that have deeply informed the political framework. So here we have reproductive justice movement as another movement to achieve reproductive justice. We must analyze power systems, address intersecting oppressions, and center those most marginalized. We join together across issues and identities, all oppressions that impact our reproductive lives. And this is generated by Sister Song, the Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. The movement really is global now. It started in the late 90s, led by Loretta Ross and a collective of women of color and Indigenous women from across the United States, really asking the question, how do we choose dignified experiences and rights to birthing, to having abortions, to raising our families, and choosing how we want to be treated under the guise of reproductive health, towards really building power, a system of power that centers Black, Indigenous women of color as valuable and not only seen to reproduce labor or to reproduce labor for slavery, or the wealthy elite, but actually to reproduce our families and next generations for our culture, for our lineage, for our survival, and for the next generation. Transformative justice as a foundation has been a foundation for healing justice. And this is a framework that really is rooted in safety, understanding community-led safety strategies that we know how to build safety for ourselves outside of a policing and surveillance and colonialist model. So how do we imagine healing from generational collective individual trauma as part of imagining ways we think about safety? That care in of itself, it is not inseparable from safety. And in order for us to take care of our communities, we have to understand, how does safety play a role? How does surveillance play a role? How does control play a role? So we're looking at, through transformative justice, also a survivor-led and community-determined strategy that always allows the survivor or survivors to have the autonomy to name what they will or will not do to build safety for themselves and our communities. It seeks to build accountability and transformation for all people, including those who do harm, who do the harm. That those of us, many of us who are survivors, are often also the same people who can cause harm. So how do we hold the balance and not engage in persecuting and imprisoning people who do harm, but actually understand transformative justice as a way to hold each other accountable, hold someone accountable for their harm and abuse, and allow the survivor who experienced that harm and abuse to name autonomously what they might need to feel safe. We are engaging in community bystanders strategies and understanding that it is not only the people who might be inside of an interpersonal violence or communal hate violence or state violence experience, but that we all, as bystanders, are part of the healing and the survivor strategies, and that we can do this without persecuting or excommunicating anyone, and not follow state ideas of you must punish people when they cause harm, but to ask the question, how do we love? How do we build power? How do we take care of one another? And when someone has harmed another, how do we hold a process that is community-led and survivor-centered, but does not seek to shut anyone down or create a punitive model? So it's hard work to move through a transformative justice process. So as healers and health practitioners, the question for us has always been rooted in abolition. How do we not police? How do we not surveil? How do we not perpetuate harms and abuses of the medical industrial complex? And how can we be accountable for our own harms and abuses through medicine? And how can we hold the institution accountable towards change and towards transformation? These political strategies and movements are deeply informing the healing justice framework. Really, healing justice couldn't have existed as a strategy without these movements and strategies underneath as foundational. And I leave you with some ideas of how to employ or apply healing justice. And I'm going to take my image out. We're looking at healing justice in this moment and how we build power. In the United States, for many healing justice organizers and practitioners, we've been looking at how do we defund the mental health and medical industrial complex institutions that we know are policing and causing harm, and how do we take those funds to resource community-led healing justice, collective care, and safety strategies. We're asking the question, how do we build infrastructure to scale? And how can collective care and safety strategies still be political and integral to political liberation, so that healing justice, again, is not for just healing's sake, but actually builds power, actually disrupts harm and abuse in state and community-led strategies that are ableist at their core, that are racist at their core, that are capitalist. Instead, how do we imagine a healthcare system or a collective care system that is not rooted in these oppressive ideas of healthy or disease or that pathologizes, but instead looks at us as human beings, looks at us collectively, and understands the value of interdependence and how we'll take care of each other in the many ways we need care. Healing justice seeks to interrupt racial capitalism and to transform generational trauma, again, as integral to our political liberation, not as an ad hoc thing, but as something that's rooted in, if we don't understand the long-term impact of generational trauma on our lived experience, then how will we imagine care that is outside of constantly reacting or responding to trauma? And how do we sustain memory of our traditions to respond to violence, to grief, to trauma, to climate change? There is a question always for us inside of healing justice, is the understanding of memory and that how memory moves from our bodies, cell to cell, ancestor to the next generation. How will we remember the stories of resistance and the stories of traditions of care and healing, be that medicines, be that methodologies, be that practices that are intuitively, ancestrally our own, that are being displaced because of war, because of attempted genocide. So how will we remember, literally, our practices for our survival? And how can we transcend borders, false borders of gender, of bodies, of global geographical realities, and really move like we need each other? And I do appreciate this invitation to this collective in Berlin, and can't wait to hear about what you're building around collective care and healing and strategies that disrupt the state and ideas of healthy that are not about taking care of our people. I want to name here that the mechanics of a healing justice strategy cannot be something that is applied generically, but it is rooted in your lived experience. Wherever I use healing justice with a community of practitioners, organizers, families, whatever that looks like, we identify, it doesn't say here, but we name, what is care? How would we define care for our communities? Care that does not rely, again, on policing and surveillance and pathologizing. And then how do we map conditions of our lands, of our bodies, of our economies, and our spirit and culture in our particular context? So in Berlin, if you mapped, what are the opportunities, what are the challenges of land, of body, of work, of spirit and culture? And then from there, mapping relationships on where do we have to hold accountability for institutions or practices that are causing harm and abuse to our care. And then how do we assess risk? How do we understand as practitioners on the front lines, if we are if we are root workers, birth workers, culture workers doing healing work, where can we disrupt without isolating ourselves? And always understanding that in a medical institution, in a community clinic, in a collective, if you understand ableism is happening, do you go it alone? We would say we invite you to understand what is the risk to disrupt a pattern of harm or abuse. If you want to shift something, we ask, how do you not work in isolation? Where do you find support that can sustain you and your vision and your strategy to work collectively? And then finally, how are we mapping resources on the ground? I often say when someone says, can you come here so we can build a healing justice strategy? And I say, well, who's on the ground doing the work? Who are the healers rooted in abolition? Who are the health practitioners who want to transform health inequities? Where do we find our people first? And then maybe calling folks in, but we need to trust that there are people in your communities doing transformative work to build power outside of the medical industrial complex and to build power that responds to generational trauma and grief. And finally, key strategic questions. And I'll share this slide deck with your community. But we always ask when we are rolling out a healing justice strategy, what are the conditions you are responding to? How do you and the communities you work with define collective healing, care, and safety? What are the risks to engage in this work collectively and individually? And what exists already? And what are the opportunities for building strategies that are new or opportunities to build onto strategies that already exist? Thank you for your time and your energy. I'm excited to see what you generate. Please send me any questions after you see this presentation, and I hope to meet you in person. Here's more information of many practitioners also doing other work, including the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective. And healingjustice.lineages.com is where we will be building a digital archive of stories across the United States of abolitionist healers and health practitioners building collective care strategies. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with you. Until soon.